Welcome to Cover Book Beat. I'm your host, Roger Nichols. Our guest today began his writing career 40 years ago, passing in boxcars under street lamps and in hobo jungles to record the beats and rhythms of the road as he caught freight trains and vagabonded around the Pacific Northwest and Canada. In the decades since, while his destinations and modes of travel have changed, Ed Davis's quest to capture the essence of traveling experience has remained true. And nowhere is this more evident than in his latest novel, The Last Professional, a compelling drama that managed to give insight into both that earlier era and the current situation as the age of the hobo heroes draws to a close. We're very pleased to welcome Ed Davis. Good morning.
Andre, it is my absolute pleasure to be here with you.
Before we get to your writing, I do want our listeners to know that you are a multi-talented person, a world-ranked discus thrower at the master's level, and you played bass for Cynthia Carr in the cartoons for 30 years, offering an eclectic blend of folk, swing, doo-wop, jazz, and Americana music. We bow to your prowess.
Well, thank you.
Now, The Last Professional is an extraordinary work, and was it easier or harder to write about your younger experiences?
Well, I tend to think that the best fiction is at its core largely autobiographical, because then the author is really sharing some of themselves with you. And so when I started writing this 40 years ago, I very closely identified with the young protagonist, Lynden Hoover. And the novel almost wrote itself.
Ah, that's great to hear, because you get in the zone and it just flows out there. But let's give them a little background. I'm not sure about how much to reveal, so maybe you would describe the basic plot so that people get a handle on what we're talking about.
Well, the basic setup takes place in the early 1980s, and a young fellow who's a very good computer programmer gets a major promotion, but also realizes that he needs to go back and confront a trauma from his past. He was abducted and abused by a tramp when he was 11 years old. And he thinks he's put that behind him, but through a set of circumstances comes to understand that he can't move forward unless he comes to grips with what's happened. So he returns to the rails. This tramp had abducted him and kept him on the rails for a couple of weeks and then abandoned him. There he meets an old fellow named the Duke, who is really the last of his kind, the last of what were called Profesh, or professional hobos. The Duke is clinging to his vanishing way of life. And so the story then plays out as these two fellows travel across much of the US, and it turns out that they're being pursued by a fellow who is out to do harm to both of them.
Excellently summarized. Couldn't have done better myself. That's why I asked you. There's an interesting structure to the novel. In addition to the chapters and back and forth, there are pages labeled as track 1, track 2 through track 6. This acts in some way as kind of a Greek chorus, because it's an interview taking place. It doesn't directly comment on the action. It gives context to it. Was this come from the start, or did that evolve as you were writing it?
Well, it was there from the start, and thank you so much for pointing that out. I was formed and influenced as a writer by the great fiction of the last century. Primarily Steinbeck is sort of my North Star. And I'm sure as you remember from The Grapes of Wrath, there were these intercession chapters that weren't specifically feeding the narrative, but gave you context.
Yeah.
And though I wasn't intentionally trying to copy that as a format, when I started to write this book, I was really trying to capture this, what I could see was a vanishing way of life from these few old guys I'd had a chance to ride with. And so I wanted not only to do that through the narrative, but I kind of wanted to delve into what were the motivations for people and what sacrifices were required to essentially give your life over to wanderlust. And those intercession chapters, those tracks, are the place that I do that.
Yeah, I take notes as I read, and I've got about 6 pages. We can't go through them all, but we're going to mention a few of them. Talking about context too, I want to note the illustrator, Colin Elgee. Now, he's been part of the artist collective Hypnosis, which is as an old DJ I'm familiar with as the album covers for Yes and a whole bunch of other really extraordinary stuff. And it's a beautiful woodcut 1930s heroic worker style that just totally complements that. How did that come about?
Well, I love, again, as I said, those novels of 100 years ago. And before the days of graphic novels, literary fiction was often illustrated. And my favorite was the 1930 edition, the Random House edition of Moby Dick,
Ah,
illustrated by Rockwell Kent. And those woodcuts, if you get a chance to look at that edition, you can not read a word of the novel, just look at the woodcuts that Kent has put together and get a pretty good idea of what that story is about. It sort of reaches you on another level. So I went looking for a contemporary who could do something in that vein. I went online. I looked on the internet. I found Colin's work. I sent him some examples of things I was interested in. He got back with a first representation of what he thought I wanted. It was spot on. There are 17 illustrations in the book plus the cover. It was only after we were entirely done that I realized that he had worked for Hypnosis and done all these amazing album covers. So
okay.
really happy accident.
Well, cool. Well, here I was going to credit you with being just a spectacular researcher, and you're also a spectacularly lucky guy at the same time.
Exactly. And I'll take luck anytime I can get it.
You know, there's an underlying theme, well, there are multiple themes. That's what makes it so rich. I believe this is one of those books that's going to repay multiple readings because you're going to get different things out of it at different times. But one of the themes is freedom. And what is freedom? And you have a lot of interesting philosophical comments about that. One of them that just struck me, as I'm going to quote here, says, "Rattling around on freights all your life doesn't make you free any more than sitting at a desk makes you a prisoner. Every guy makes himself free the best way he can, or he puts himself in a cage. It's up to him." This is great observation. Are you part psychiatrist as well?
Not at all. But one of the things writing freights does, and I had a chance to do that off and on for about 10 years, is it gives you a lot of time to think. The hobos are America's original Zen masters. Had to have a lot of patience because the trains move at their own pace and you can't push it. You can't make things happen faster than they're going to. And so there's a great deal of time to sit while you're waiting for the northbound to take you to the next place where you can maybe pick up a meal to figure out what this life is like. And I think we tend to categorize the choices we make by the outer manifestations of how we live. So a guy who's a businessman faces different choices than a guy who's a manual laborer, faces different choices than a guy who's a psychiatrist or an engineer. I'm not sure that's true at all. I think the choices are all the same. And that's what I'm trying to get at.
Which leads me to another quote that I have to quote because I really like this one. It says, "We're all of us on a train. It don't run smooth, it don't run easy, and it don't run 1 minute longer than it's meant to. You got to ride it or let it ride you. That's all the choice we really got." I think that's brilliant writing
Well,
myself.
thank you so much.
Yeah, yeah, and in addition to all observation, I also point out that throughout the book, you're defining some of the classic hobo tunes or terms. There are dozens of them tossed in there. One of my most interesting ones I thought was "blowed in the glass," as in being genuine, and compared that with the other "dyed in the wool," which I can see the derivation of both of them. Really fascinating.
Yeah, the interesting origin of blowed in the glass goes back 150 or 200 years to the time when people would counterfeit things that were put in bottles. So if the name of the bottler was blowed in the glass in the
Uh,
bottom of the glass, then you knew it was genuine. So if you were a blowed in the glass hobo, we knew you were genuine.
Fascinating, fascinating. And do they still do the hobo conventions, or is that
They
gone?
they do. Britt, Iowa does it every year. I had hoped to make it last year and it didn't work out. I may yet make it this year.
Hmm.
It's changed a great deal. It's a wonderful thing that Britt does. It used to attract whoever was left of the hobo culture. They're
Hmm.
mostly gone.
Yeah.
So it's become a town festival. They have a great time. They do hobo weddings. They have hobo song fests. Uh, but it's a tourist attraction more than a gathering of actual hobos.
Hmm. Do, I just have a weird thought. Is there a chance there that you would be able to find some hobos and ask them to read the book and see what they thought about it?
Well, as a matter of fact, there are still guys writing. I've just come off a month-long book tour, all by, or most of it by Amtrak. And one of the first stops was at the Nevada State Railroad Museum. A bunch of guys who had ridden when they were young, like me, showed
Yeah.
up, which was great. So I had a chance to talk to some contemporaries. It was really wonderful. But the most interesting to me was a young fellow. Um, there are still guys writing, and they sort of fall into two categories. They're the adrenaline junkies who jump from car to car and they take risks, and they're a pain for the railroad crew, and they get hurt and often killed.
Yeah.
Then there are the guys who are still doing it right. They're doing it because it feeds their soul in some way.
Hmm.
And a young fellow just like that was at this thing at the Railroad Museum. He asked great questions. He was very attentive. He was very respectful. He showed me some pictures he'd taken of himself riding today in exactly the way I would have ridden 40 years ago.
Yeah.
So that was very cool.
And I also should mention that there's some very practical advice in here, including orienting yourself before you fall asleep in the boxcar. Can you share that
Yeah.
with us, please?
Well, it's you learn quickly a couple of things for your safety. One is that if you're going to fall asleep on a car, you don't do it with your head in the direction that the car is traveling, because trains stop very fast, and you can end up smashing your head into the headboard. Another is, if you're going to try to catch a boxcar, there are virtually none left. But if you're going to try to catch a boxcar and you have an open door, you always want to make sure the opposite door isn't also open, because when you throw your backpack in, it may sail out the other side.
Yeah.
And this is probably the time for the public service announcement that I feel obliged to make at every one of these. Riding trains is illegal. It always has been, and it's terribly, terribly dangerous. So please, anyone listening to this, do not try it. Experience it vicariously through my book.
There you go. You've satisfied the conventions, and don't try this at home, kids.
Exactly.
As they used to say, as they showed us the Three Stooges cartoon or
Precisely.
shorts. Yes, yeah. There's another philosophical piece. There's some observational stuff here. Again, it says until you're 20, 25, maybe you're picking stuff up all the time, like putting money in the bank. Then for a good long spell, you've got all you want, the account's full, but sooner or later, things turn around on you. It's time to start paying out a little every day. Then before you know it, you've got nothing left to pay with. There's this kind of, as somebody who's in his 70s now, you start to look and think, do I really need all this stuff? And it's kind of an interesting philosophical shift in attitude.
Very much. And it's one of the things that's been a great experience for me, is because the span of this book's story from when I started writing it over 40 years ago to when it was published earlier this year is that I was a young man when I started, and I'll turn 70 this year.
Ah,
And so getting a chance to have that scope of perspective over 4 decades is that notion of, when you're young, what matters to you, what's important, and do those things change as you get older? And of course they do. The things you value, the things you think are important when you're a kid that really aren't, the things you don't really pay much attention to when you're young and you find out as you get older, are the only things that matter.
yeah. I have to share a personal. When my father turned 60, I asked him if he had any wisdom for me. And he thought a long time, and he finally came up. He says, "Family and friends. That's all that really matters."
Yep.
I thought, okay.
Yep.
I tried to tell that to my kids when I turned 60, and they said, "Yeah, sure, Dad, whatever."
Yeah.
They'll pick it up. They'll pick it
And
up.
at its heart, this book is about a relationship. I mean, that's really what it's about. And it's the relationships after everything else falls away that matter most.
Yeah, and as Duke and our young fella engage, they sometimes bristle at each other, and they sometimes really engage with each other, just like any other partnership out there.
Yeah. Yeah. I did not know my father, much like Lynden. And so have been lucky in a lot of my life to find mentors. people who I could look to for guidance and who looked to me and could see in me the potential that I didn't have a father there to see.
Mhm.
And so that relationship between Lynden and the Duke is very true to my own experience, where you look for someone who can see in you things you can't see in yourself.
So, have you already cast the movie?
Well, you bet. Well, I actually think Ed Harris would be perfect for the Duke.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And failure is not an option here. Yeah. So, great stuff here. Where do you go from here? What's next for you? I know you're a prolific writer, and I should probably mention that you have done a lot of interesting things, including writing a 24-hour novel in 24 hours. Um, what's your next challenge?
I've finished a long book called Four in Stone. It's like Steinbeck's or similar to Steinbeck's East of Eden, that takes place in a fictional town in Northern California, based upon the place where I grew up. I'm currently putting together, finishing a collection of short stories that also take place in that town. So for the last year, I've really been doing a great deal of marketing for The Last Professional. That's how writers have to do it these days. And it's been delightful. Man, this trip I took around the country is over 7,000 miles, 15 cities, 30 days, probably more than 20 events. Was just fantastic for someone who likes to travel, and particularly likes to travel by train. It was great, but I'm ready to get back to doing some writing.
We should point out that you actually bought tickets
Yes.
for
Oh,
this
yes.
whole thing. That's the whole thing, and you called it the Whistle Stop Tour, which is reminiscent of the campaigns that the candidates used to do back in the day.
Yeah, and boy, people were so appreciative, both of the fact that we did it and so welcoming, but just the notion there's a romance associated with American train travel. And you know, you tell people I'm going to do this, and they'd say, "Can I come?" That was always the first response.
What a great idea. We should mention as some of your if people are interested, where they can get the book, find out more about you, websites, etc. We should get all that information out to
You
people.
bet. So my website is eddavisbooks.com. There are links there to all the books and how to buy them. I've really tried to support local bookstores. That's one of the things we did on this tour is we tried to get to out of the way bookstores. You know, Amazon sells 60% of all the books sold today. They don't need my help selling books, but the locals do. If for your readers who or listeners rather who haven't checked out bookshop.org, it is a wonderful alternative to Amazon. And some of the proceeds go to local bookstores.
Ah,
So,
great.
but as they say on TV, anywhere books are sold, you can find my books.
All right. Well, you have been very gracious with your time with us today. Is there anything we have not touched on you want to make sure that people know?
No, you got it. It's I sincerely hope that people have a chance to experiencing what is now this essentially vanished way of life through reading this book, and maybe there'll be some things there that resonate with their own experience.